So this is a very, very interesting anecdote. Here, all of us know about Maharishi Narada. So he is a Deva-rishi. He goes to one of the Manasa Putras of Brahma, who is Maharishi Sanat Kumara. And he says that, can you accept me as your disciple? Now, sage Narada knows everything. So when he wants to be accepted as a disciple, Sanat Kumara Maharishi wants to know, okay, first tell me what all you know, so that I can decide whether, I can accept you as a disciple or not. Narada says, I know a few things. Look at the humility with which he's presenting his information to the sage. So he gives an entire list. And we should remember, understanding the Vedas is impossible because it is supposed to be the entire existential knowledge. Whatever knowledge we see in this universe is considered as Veda. Vid means knowledge. So the knowledge base is Vedas. So Sage Narada says, I know the Vedas. So he starts explaining with that. And then he says that I know the Puranas, the Itihasas. I know a bit of grammar. I know arithmetics, geometry. I know about astronomy, philosophy, physics, warfare, astronomy. He just keeps on mentioning a lot of these things. And finally, he says, can you please accept me as your disciple? So that is a mind-boggling thing on how people, in spite of so many things they know, still had the urge to learn a lot more. In fact, that is the way our country has been named. Our country is called as Bharatam. In Sanskritam, Bhasu Ratam Bharatam. Bhasu means the effulgence, the radiance. Ratam means one who's immersed in that radiance, one who's into it, completely into the Bharatam. In fact, the Lord Sun God is called as Bhaskara because he's got that radiance, that effulgence in him. People of our country are called Bharatiya because they are again immersed in this happiness of knowledge. So Bharatam is a country where people engrossed and they were happy to learn more and more and more. And that's there in our DNA. Now, Sage Narada says, I know all this. Can you accept me as your disciple? And this is the beginning of that entire Upanishad, and the Upanishad goes on like that. So here it says, this is from the Chandogya Upanishad. So the very second sloka, I think this is. So here the question and answer comes where Narada says that I know all these, but please accept me as your disciple. So what all do we have in that sense? This is the essence of what we have, because if we have to understand our scriptures, we have to know the buckets in which it is grouped. As I said, the entire knowledge is called as Vedas. Now this Veda is called as the Angi, or if you imagine a person, it is the Atma of that person. The whatever is the essence of the learning is the Vedas. Now for our ease, in Dwapara Yuga, sage Vedavyasa compiled it into 4 different parts, where he called it as Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Sama Veda, and Atharva Veda. This is again for just our convenience, because he thought as the time goes by, people will not be able to go into the entire Veda because of the time available, and he knows he's able to see the future. So he says that it's going to be difficult for all of you to understand. So he says, I will break it down into 4 categories. And how he divided the 4 categories is the Rig are in the form of the hymns. So it's called as Rig in Sanskrit. So whatever was in the form of the hymns is classified as Rig Veda. Yajus basically is a prose order. So whatever was in the order of prose was calculated or was compiled as Yajur Veda. Whatever had the musical note is called as a Sama Veda. Atharvana Veda had a combination of all these 3 things. So some people call it as Veda Trayi also. When people call it as 3 Vedas, it means they are speaking about the pattern of the Vedas, the Rig, Yajus, and Sama. Whether it is in the hymn or it is in a prose order or whether it is as a musical note is what determines whether it is Veda Trayi. When they say Veda Chatushtayam, it means that because Atharva Veda has all these three forms, it is all brought in together. So that's the way we understand it. Now, in order to understand Vedas, which is in the form of a seed, because everything is compiled, when we look at acronyms, how do we understand it? Unless you expand it, it is very difficult to understand, right? So everything is in the seed form in Vedas. So if you have to understand it, you have to have some basic knowledge about grammar. Where do you split the information? How do you split it? The logic which people used at that point of time. You have to understand the different Vedangas, as we call it. For what you have to use it, at what time you have to use it. Jyotisha Shastram therefore becomes very important. All these are called as the Vedangas. And with Vedangas, it is a very intellectual approach. It's a lot about, understanding the right grammar and things like that. It is a lot of complicated things. So people usually ask for, do we have live examples? Have people been there, done it? Can you elaborate how people implemented it, etc., etc.? And that is when we give the examples of Ramayana, Mahabharata, the Itihasas, Puranas, everything. So this is the major classification with which we have to understand the Vidya stanas, or the sources of knowledge. So these are the sources of knowledge of our ancient scriptures, where we have the four Vedas, which are primary. The Vedangas are like the limbs of our body. So the Siksha, Vyakarna is the grammar. Shiksha is the way we pronounce things. Chandas is the poetic meter. Kalpa is how we have to perform the rituals. The Nirukta is supposed to be like the, I'll explain Nirukta as we proceed. Jyotisha Shastram is basically the right time for us to calculate based on the astronomical events. Nirukta we can understand as the etymology. Now I was explaining about Basuratam Bharatam, Samyakkritam Sanskritam, right? All these are the etymologies. So when we have a lot of words in Vedas, how do we understand the etymology to understand things deeper? So that is a huge science by itself. So these are the different limbs of the Vedas, which will help us to understand the Vedas. So when we look at the Upangas, we speak about Nyaya. Nyaya Shastra is completely logic. Today people say, we have to look at everything logically. Now Nyaya Shastra is completely the logicians. They explain about how to interpret different things. Okay, so when you give a particular statement to them, they will ask so many logical questions before they conclude. And that is the way a lot of intangible things are brought to light to us. Now, I spoke about giving examples, right? So how do we give examples? That is when we use the Itihasas, Puranas, all that comes under the head of Puranas. The do's or don'ts are mentioned in the Dharma Shastras. The Mimamsa is again explained, is to understand the Vedas better. So all these are called as the Upangas. And finally, with all this knowledge, we have to implement it. That implementation is in our hands. So how do we implement it? So for health, we use the Ayurveda Shastra. For the weaponry, the warfare and other things, people use the Dhanur Veda. That was the implementation part of it. The Gandharva Veda is all about music, dance, the different art forms, everything. Artha Shastram is about leadership, politics, the entire management concept that we are speaking today, economics, everything comes under the Artha Shastra. So we had the knowledge sources and the implementation of knowledge. All these were called as Vidya stanas and Dharma stanas, which is how we understand the source of knowledge and how we implement the knowledge. So this is the huge repository which people had given us. Now with this source of knowledge, we had 64 different art forms. I'm just going to show you the art forms. I'm not going to get into the details of the art forms. So people had 64 art forms where they showed their different talents and creativity. Now, with so much of information, what is the next step? How do we implement these things in our life? Okay, so where do we get started? Because we understand that The repository is huge. There are so many things for us to understand. But now our background, the way we are brought up, the exposure that we have is totally different. So where do I get started? So there is a lot of things like this which we'll share. So Dhanyavadaha. See you all tomorrow. Namaste.